Hello and welcome back to Pull List Priority, the podcast where we give you the history of Marvel and DC Comics without all the filler. I am Adam J, and yeah, it's been about 2 months since I first released issue 0. Some stuff came up and I just didn't get around to reading the comics like I thought I would, but I've buckled down. I've decided that I'm going to really dedicate myself to this, and we're officially starting with issue number 1 today, where we're going to be covering the year of 1938 in DC Comics. A few things before we get started, a few housekeeping things. I have been reading other comics outside of just the DC comics that are in 1938. Namely Spider-Man Life Story, which has been a fantastic read. I'll be going over Spider-Man Life Story in our first one-shot episode, which will be coming out this week, probably tomorrow, before our issue number 2, which will continue the usual timeline. So there are a few comics that I have where I'm going to do that. I'm going to do one-shot issues that are just covering other comics that aren't in the timeline, that are sort of standalone stories. For now, I've got Spider-Man Life Story planned. I've also got Joker, Far Sector, and Batman Year One planned as future one-shot episodes. But I'm reading those as I go. The only one I've read so far is I'm about halfway through halfway through Life Story, and that, like I said, will be a one-shot episode coming up in the near future. So, back to sort of the plan for this podcast, because ideally you're listening to this after issue number 0, but if you've been listening along from the beginning, you'll know that the plan for this podcast is to give you just the plot, right? Because there's so much filler in comic books, and if you wanted to read every comic dating all the way back to the original Action Comics, you wouldn't have time. So I have been curating a list of comic books that are just the plot for continuing stories, right? Because comic books have so much filler that it can be intimidating to get into them. And if you want to know, okay, well, this random character appeared in Superman comics in 2012, but he had his origin in 1950, how can you, but you want to know about that history, that's what this podcast is for. It's to give you sort of the background for everything in Marvel and DC Comics from the original, from 1938, all the way to the present. So, for this episode, we'll be covering 2 issues from Action Comics. We'll be covering Action Comics number 1 and Action Comics number 6. Because again, we're just covering the plot. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into Action Comics number 1. So Action Comics number 1, the story was just called Superman. And that's the other thing. We'll only be covering the superhero-related issues or stories in each issue, right? Because comic books back in the day, back in the 1930s, when Action Comics number 1 was released, had 4 or 5 different stories in the book, right? It was 60 some odd pages, and maybe only 13 of those pages would be dedicated to Superman, right? And then the other pages would be other characters. Action Comics did also introduce a character named Zatanna, Zatara rather, who is the father of Zatanna. But I'm choosing not to cover his issues because his stories never really are serialized in the same way that Superman eventually becomes serialized, and a lot of other superheroes become serialized. So I'm choosing not to cover Zatara, and I'll just be covering Superman from Action Comics until you hear otherwise. So, as I said, without any further ado, we'll go ahead and get into Action Comics number 1, just the Superman story. Um, Actually, no, looking at my notes, there are a few other things that I want to talk about first. So, the idea of Superman actually predates Action Comics number 1, because in January of 1933, Jerry Siegel, one of the creators of Superman, wrote a short story called "The Reign of Superman," and it was in it was in prose. It was just and it wasn't a comic book, right? It was just a short story that had an illustration, and the illustration was of a bald man with telepathic powers, and it almost resembled more of Lex Luthor than Superman. When I first read this, I read this in college when I was writing a term paper on Superman, and it was such an interesting idea that this was the original conception of Superman as a villain. He was a bad guy with telepathic powers. But when they wanted to create a character they could sell to newspapers, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, right? Siegel was the writer, Shuster was the one who drew the illustration. They reinvented the idea of Superman into a superhero. So we start with issue number 1. It was written by credited to Joe Shuster and Jerome Siegel, as opposed to Jerry Siegel, which is sort of how he is often referred to in modern conversations and in modern media. So I just thought that was interesting that he's Jerome Siegel and Joe Shuster. Again, Shuster being the writer of the story, and Siegel, or no, I'm sorry, other way around. Siegel being the writer of the story, and Shuster being the illustrator. So we start with the destruction of Krypton, but I don't think it's called Krypton. All we get is, as a distant planet was destroyed by old age, a scientist placed his infant son within a hastily devised spaceship, launching it toward Earth. So we don't get the name Krypton, but we have the idea of Krypton already established in Superman lore, and that Superman is an alien from another world who just happens to look like humans. So an interesting difference between this origin in the original 1938 comic and the story that most of us know about Superman is that there are no Kents in this story. No Martha and John Kent to pick him up. He's just found by a passing motorist. And this, as the comic calls it, a driver passing by this field, and he finds the boy and takes him to an orphanage. And I think it's funny. One of the things that this comic does that's very interesting is they try to give a scientific explanation of Clark Kent's amazing strength, as the comic says. And the examples they use are ants and grasshoppers, because ants can famously carry like multiple times their own body weight, and grasshoppers can jump very high. And the original Superman, as conceived in 1938, couldn't fly. He could just jump really high. So that is the original conception of Superman and how they tried to explain his strength. We couldn't just say, oh, he's from another planet, so he's strong. They had to try to come up with some explanation for it. So Clark is an adult. We brush over his childhood very briefly. We see him holding up a chair in a single hand as an infant, but that's really all we get of him as a child. So the next thing we know, Clark's an adult, and as Superman, he is rushing to see, quote, the governor for a, quote, matter of life or death. So he arrives at the governor's house, and the governor's butler tries to tell him, hey, he's not really seeing anybody right now. It's late. Come back another time. And Clark refuses to take no for an answer, or Superman, I should say, refuses to take no for an answer. He sees a metal door leading to the governor's room, and he rips the metal door off the wall. And the reason why he was in such a hurry is because Clark has Superman. I should say that I should differentiate between when I'm talking about Clark Kent and when I'm talking about Superman. So all of this has been Superman. So Superman rips off the metal door, and the reason why Superman has been in such a hurry is because Superman has evidence of a woman's guilt. And this woman is on death row, and she's to be executed in 15 minutes. I love how, I don't know how Superman would know this. I love that that he just knows she's going to be executed in 15 minutes. And that's so specific a time frame. Her execution is happening in 15 minutes, and he's trying to save her, and he thinks going to the governor would do it. And maybe in 1938 it would. But I just find this whole story very funny. Or the whole idea very funny. So, as Superman is trying to convince the governor, hey, she's innocent, and here's proof, I have a signed confession from the person who did it, the butler, who was trying to get Superman to go away, shoots Superman. But obviously nothing happens to Superman. And then I have the quote, he's on the side of law and justice, and the governor stays her execution, and everyone lives happily ever after in that part of the story. There's sort of three stories here. No, three stories in the first Action Comics that all sort of run into each other. So the next day at work, Clark Kent now works at the Daily Star as opposed to the Daily Planet. It's called the Daily Star. And he hears about a wife beating. He hears a phone tip about a wife beating. So he goes as Superman to try to save her. The man tries to stab Superman, but his knife breaks and Superman takes care of him. Back at the Daily Star, Clark asks Lois on a date, and he has apparently been badgering her to go out with him. Clark Kent has the biggest crush on Lois Lane. And Lois finally agrees and gives him a chance. And one of the things that I love about early Superman, that I've learned about early Superman, and that makes me like early Superman more than, contemporary Superman, or more than someone like Batman, is that Clark Kent in early Superman is vulnerable, right? As Clark Kent, he doesn't, as Superman, he can solve all the world's problems. He can save a woman from being executed. He can stop a wife beating. But as Clark Kent, he can't have the woman that he wants. It's very much like Spider-Man in this sense, in that he has all of these great powers, but can't actually get the girl of his dreams as a civilian. And this is going to become further confused later when Lois develops a thing for Superman. And we'll see that in Action Comics number 6, the next issue that we'll be covering here. So, Clark being vulnerable as Clark is so interesting to me, and it makes him a more compelling character, that he doesn't always just solve every problem. As Superman, he can solve any problem, but as Clark Kent, he can't solve the question or the issue of his own love life. So Clark asks Lois on a date, and Lois finally agrees. While they're out dancing, a man butts in and tries to dance with Lois. And Lois is like, Clark, won't you stand up for yourself, and won't you stand up for me? But Clark concedes and lets the man dance with Lois because he doesn't want to injure the man if he were to attack him. The man, we find out, his name is Butch Matson. Butch Matson. So, Lois, when Clark agrees to let Butch dance with Lois, Lois is not having that, and she storms off. But when she storms off, Butch pursues her. Lois drives off, and Butch and his people drive after her. Now, Superman, Clark Kent now as Superman, makes his way in front of the car, in front of Butch's car, stops it, picks it up, and slams it. If you see the picture, or just picks it up and sort of shakes it, and if you see the cover of Action Comics #1, that is what the scene comes from, right? It's Superman picking up the car, Butch's car. That is the cover of Action Comics #1. He grabs Butch and hangs him by a lamppost and saves Lois from Butch, but the next day at work at the Daily Star, Lois is cold to Clark. Then we sort of get another story, the sort of closer for this one, and the thing that leads into Action Comics 2, even though we won't be reading Action Comics 2. Clark decides to, or Superman rather, gets involved with a politician. There's a politician Senator Barrows, who is talking with a man named Alex Greer. And Clark overhears them talking about a bill that Greer wants Barrows to push through. He says that the bill will embroil the U.S. with Europe. And that is seen as a bad thing, as something Superman needs to stop. So I think that's interesting that in the very first comic, the very first Superman comic, we got political, right? In that Superman is supposed to stop a bill that embroils the U.S. with Europe because that's seen as an objectively bad thing that Superman needs to stop. It's not even addressed why Superman needs to stop it. It's just, this is an inherently bad thing, and Superman stopping it is an inherently good thing. So I just find that very interesting. So, Alex Greer and Senator Barrows are talking, and Greer leaves the room, and Superman's waiting for him. And he tries to get who Barrows works for out of him, and Barrows refuses. So Superman grabs him by the ankle, and he starts running, and jumping with holding Greer. They're running on power lines. He takes him by the Capitol, and then we get a to be continued. And if you want to know what happened to Alex Greer and Superman after this, you'll have to find it on your own in Action Comics #2, because we're not covering Action Comics #2. I'm only covering Action Comics #1 even, because it introduces Clark and Lois, and Superman, right? A lot of classic Superman characters, even characters that we associate with the Daily Planet, like Perry White and Jimmy Olsen, aren't in Action Comics #1. But I wanted to cover Action Comics #1, obviously, because it's the first Superman story. I think it's one of the few comic books that has its own Wikipedia page, just because it is so notable and famous in the world of comics. So we move on now to issue #6. Issue #6 is interesting. It's also called, this story is also just called Superman. Issue #6 is interesting because it's the first. It has two firsts. One of them is the first use of the Man of Steel moniker for Superman. Appears in Action Comics #6. It's one of the reasons we're covering it. But Action Comics #6 also features the debut of one of those characters I just mentioned, who we usually associate with the Daily Planet, but we didn't see in Action Comics #1. So let's go ahead and get into issue #6. Clark Kent, as a reporter, is introduced to the manager of Superman. And this is obviously interesting to Clark because he is Superman and he does not have a manager, as I'm sure you piece together. So he wants an interview with Superman. So the manager sets up an interview with them for later that night. A boy has his ear to the door and hears that Clark is going to get to interview Superman. And that boy would later be Jimmy Olsen. So issue number 6, even though he's not named, issue number 6 is the debut of Jimmy Olsen. And that's the main reason we're covering issue number 6. But while we're here, let's go ahead and talk about the story, right? So what's going on with this fake Superman? So when the boy hears that Superman is going to, or that Clark is going to have an interview with Superman, Lois, who's already infatuated with Superman by this point for saving her in issue number 1 and in other issues that we skipped, Lois wants to get the interview, get the scoop, and meet the real Superman. So she actually asks Clark on a date. And remember, after issue number 1, she did not want to have anything to do with Clark. And Clark sees through this, but pretends like he doesn't, right? And he agrees to the date with Lois. And while they're out, Lois puts a drug in Clark's drink that should knock him out. And he pretends to go to sleep, or he seemingly goes to sleep. We don't know he's pretending. But he goes to sleep, passes out, and Lois goes in to go meet Superman in his place. And then we realize that Clark was tricking her, and he takes off to go follow Lois. So Lois is meeting with the fake Superman, and we see a meeting between the manager and the fake Superman, where fake Superman is like, is this really a good idea? You know, this reporter might figure out that we're lying. And the manager tries to tell him, like, hey, no, don't worry about it. Everything's going to be okay. Like, there's no way they could know. So Lois arrives, and she immediately has doubts that this is the real Superman, because she's met Superman by this point. So he does seemingly amazing feats. He bends what appears to be a metal bar. He lifts what appears to be a heavy desk table. But Lois sees through all this. She even picks up the table herself, noting that it's just cardboard, and it just looked like a heavy desk or table. So the manager and fake Superman see that Lois knows too much, and they decide to get rid of her. So they throw her out a window. But luckily for us, Superman arrived just in time to catch Lois. He saves Lois, confronts fake Superman and the manager. Fake Superman punches Superman and breaks his own hand, which I thought was interesting, in that we don't see that enough in comics, where someone punches Superman so hard they break their own hand. Fake Superman punches real Superman, breaks his hand, and Superman scoops up Lois and fake Superman and the manager and takes them to the police and drops them off, and tells the police to take in fake Superman and the manager for attempted murder because they tried to throw Lois out a window. And at the end of this comic, we get a little thing called acquiring super strength muscle training, where they try to tell us something you can do with your hands, like a little hand and wrist workout, to acquire super strength. So very similar to the scientific explanation of Superman's strength, trying to give you an idea of how you can get some of Superman's strength yourself. So both of these issues were released in 1938, as I said. They were sold for 10 cents, which is the equivalent of about $2 in 2025. And yeah, these are sort of the early stories of Superman. The next issue that we're going to be covering, right? Because we're not going in order, we're sort of jumping around. The next issue that we're going to be covering, we're going to cover a lot of comics because 1938 was sort of a mild year for comics, right? We only really got some action comics. But we're going to look at a few different comics. So at the end of every episode, I'm going to tell you the comics that we're going to be covering if you want to read along for the next issue. So be expecting the Spider-Man Life Story one-shot. But for issue number 2 of Pull List Priority, we're going to be covering Action Comics number 13, number 14, and number 17. We'll also be covering Detective Comics numbers 27 and 33, and Marvel Comics number 1, Marvel Mystery Comics number 2, Marvel Mystery Comics number 3, and Superman issue number 1, Superman's first issue in his solo series. So we've got a few characters that we're going to be meeting in these next few comics, including the first recurring villain for Superman. We're going to be meeting both Marvel and DC Comics because Marvel Comics began in 1939, began publishing superhero stories at least in 1939. So we're going to be meeting our first Marvel heroes. We're going to be meeting another DC hero, and if you're familiar with the history of DC Comics at all, you'll know that Detective Comics number 27 is where we meet our first new hero, and continuing adventures of Superman. Again, the first recurring villain in Superman's Rogues Gallery. And that is your first episode of Pull List Priority, your first full episode of Pull List Priority. If you want to get in contact with the show or just want updates and want to discuss comics with me, you can follow me on Twitter, because I refuse to call it X. You can follow me on Twitter at Pull Priority Pod. That's Pull Priority Pod at Twitter. And for now, that is the only way I have for you to get in contact with me. But I hope that you enjoyed the first issue of Pull List Priority, where we covered again Action Comics number 1 and Action Comics number 6. I encourage you to follow along and read the comics that we're going to be covering for issue number 2. I'm going to certainly start on them much sooner than I did for this episode. I'm dropping this episode on Wednesday, and I hope to drop further episodes on Wednesdays because I learned that is when new comics come out. So I want my podcast to sort of live in that same space as well, and to also issue new episodes on Wednesday. So be looking for the next episode next Wednesday. We'll be covering like 7 more comics, and hopefully we'll have a much meatier episode for you by then. That's all for this episode. Thank you. And remember, I'm AJD, and keep reading comics.